Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week, we're sharing a recent chat with Jazz and Badger, two residents of Barnardsville, a small village just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. We spoke about the community, the impact of Hurricane Helene, some lessons learned from coordinating among the neighbors, and how people are faring now, nearly 5 months out from the storm. To hear similar stories from after the storm, you can find links to past interviews in our show notes alongside links to groups working in the area, a few articles concerning government response, and interviews recorded by Blue Ridge Public Radio. If you'd like to help out after recent flooding in eastern Kentucky, there are links in our show notes to Hillbillies Helping Hillbillies, aka Eastern Kentucky or EKY Mutual Aid.
I am Badger, they, them. I am an RN and street medic trainer. And I volunteer with Mutual Aid Disaster Relief.
And my name is Jazz, he, him. I live in Barnardsville and do a lot of things, forestry and mutual aid work, and have been working a lot with the Barnardsville Area Resiliency Network, or BARN. It's kind of a new thing since the storm, and a lot of other mutual aid projects in the region.
I wonder if you could speak about the Barnardsville area, the landscape, the infrastructure, the people, and the economy before the storm.
Yeah, sure. I didn't mention initially that I also was very involved with Barnardsville Area Resilience Network, and I live in Barnardsville and have lived here off and on since 2014. It's a rural area, primarily an agricultural area, and I think about 2,500 people. And we are very fortunate. We usually think we're very fortunate to have a lot of amazing riparian networks going all throughout our area. And we're also in and on the edge of the national forest. Some parts of Barnardsville are in the national forest, some are on the edge. Yeah, so headed into the storm, we have this amazing topography, super mountainous, lots of riparian areas, and a small, tight-knit community. Those two things really came together in both horrible and amazing ways in the storm. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty well. So riparian, for folks that don't know the term, is a river, right?
Yeah, river and waterways.
Cool.
Just the riparian zone is like the area, the land adjoining the river, next to the river. It's really like pretty fertile land. And yeah, I guess just a little bit about also like the pre-storm economy in quotes in a way in Barnardsville. It's technically a town, but pretty much just has a post office, and it had one restaurant, which is gone, and 2 gas stations. And so that's pretty much the extent. Definitely remnants in the quote unquote downtown area of at some point there was more businesses, but it's pretty rural and not much of an economy. It's pretty close to Asheville. And so a lot of people commute there to work, but
we do have a lot of amazing working farms, and that is from what I understand from folks at Big Ivy Community Center, which is really the town center energetically in a way, not necessarily physically, but that agriculture is the primary economic force in Barnardsville. And then there are just a ton of small businesses as well. Everything from people making tempeh in their little warehouse up the road to people there are several wilderness education companies, and there's a zip line tourist oriented organization. And Yeah. So it is kind of amazing because we are really close to Asheville and a lot of people do commute, but a lot of people don't commute. And there is actually a pretty strong economy, not a wealthy or affluent economy, but stable out here in Barnardsville.
I'm imagining because of the geography that you have lots of little like pockets of folks. You've got people living up this branch or whatever, all like a little bit isolated from each other, but sharing the general topography, the general border with is it Pisgah National Forest? Is that the forest there?
It is, yeah. And I think that's a very accurate description. Lots of little pockets and hollers and things like that.
Someone described tight-knit communities. That's where you don't have a lot of resources and people are sort of like tied in their proximity to each other, like taking responsibility for each other. That sort of like geographic setting is kind of important to talk about, like, well, A, how the water will flow, but also B, how people get disconnected and how they connect back with each other. So could you talk a bit about how Hurricane Helene changed the area and how it's impacted you and others in Barnardsville?
Yeah. It's honestly, it's hard to talk about still. It's been such a devastating shift in our landscape. But like most river areas in Western North Carolina, our rivers flooded. We have lots of little streams emptying into our rivers. And so there's some parts of Barnardsville, basically two main roads where an extraordinary number of houses just went down the stream or down the river. And people not only lost their house, but they lost their land. The land is just riverbed now, and the county won't allow people to rebuild on it. And so we have, for such a tiny town, we have a pretty enormous campground situation happening at our community center, and then a lot of smaller compounds, basically large family units, friends and family units that are camping together, often around one house that is serving as a hub. And those things were not necessarily the case before the storm. People just, their houses are just gone. And then, of course, a lot of people had trees fall on their houses and things like that. So that's been an extraordinary amount of repair work. And some of those houses aren't salvageable either.
And something like somebody quoted early on after the storm, something like 2,000 landslides around the region too, like the wider region, not just Barnardsville, but I'm sure that like also impacted, like pushing down or just moving or totally destroying people's houses as well, right?
We had 4 landslides, and the amazing thing is none of them destroyed houses. They sometimes came within 20 feet of a house, but we were really lucky in that regard. So, not as lucky in other regards, but.
This is going to be a multi-part. I imagine that a lot of people are on well water, but can you talk about like water access, water tables, electricity, internet, cell service, like those sorts of infrastructure or roads? What happened during this?
Yeah, you're kind of talking about like in the immediate aftermath of the storm.
Yeah. Just to get sort of a sense for listeners.
I mean, pretty immediately after the storm was this realization of like the scale of devastation in the area. So on like an infrastructure level with the roads, like one of our major roads, Dillingham, was completely just overtaken by the river. Like there was a river there where a road used to be. Bridges going to some other like major areas like up Poverty Branch, like those bridges were wiped out, which were on public roads. But then there was also a huge amount of like private bridges that people had like over their streams or across the Ivy River to get to their houses that were wiped out. No electricity kind of across the region, and especially here, and with that, no cell service or internet or any of the like So like kind of like driving through after the storm, there's just power lines down everywhere, and just like the air was thick with the smell of propane, kerosene. So yeah, there was like a complete destruction of a lot of like public infrastructure.
You asked about wells. I definitely anybody in the little riparian areas that we were talking about, those flat areas around the river, had wells that were submerged, which meant that they were considered contaminated at that point. A lot of people live up a bit from the rivers, so I think a strength of our community is that not everybody had access to water, but collectively we had a lot of access to good, clean water. And we were able, even before we had any water supplies or anything being delivered, we were working on our own systems, and we had people donating buckets and other people taking buckets or containers or whatever we could find and filling them up at their springs or whatever they had, and then bringing them back down to the post office where other people could come and pick them up and have water for themselves. So we weren't dealing with some of the water issues that some of the other areas were, although we had a lot of water issues.
People had wells that weren't contaminated. Once they were able to get a generator, or if they already had one, they're able to pretty quickly like get water. And there's lots of springs and even like some artesian wells in the area. So pretty quickly we realized like that was one of the things that we had that a lot of other places didn't have, was access to water. And so that was something we worked on a lot, was like trying to get water out.
Yeah, I know that in like Asheville, where I'm based out of, that was one of the big ongoing problems, was being on the municipal water system and having the connection to the reservoir be broken and the filtration system be down, that getting water into people's houses for flushing, let alone like potable water, was like a huge issue. That's pretty awesome that y'all were able to get a hub set up around the post office.
Yeah, nobody could flush either, but we are out in the woods, so we didn't hear too much about that being a concern. I think people just took care of what they had to take care of out in the woods, which does make life easier because that's harder to do in the city.
And it's also really like case specific too. Like there's like an elderly woman that lived on my street, and that was like every day it was like bringing her a bucket of water or two for like flushing and stuff. So yeah, there was a need out here, but we had the water. It was just kind of finding the cracks and the people that needed it.
So when I talked to Janet from Roar in Madison County, one of the things that resonates from that conversation for me was having pre-existing relationships between people that could be the sort of like foundation or basis for building, strengthening and expanding out mutual aid among folks. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, before Helene hit, what the mutual aid in the network looked like, and some of the challenges, like some of the shifts that made after the storm, and some of the challenges that you faced early on in the days after Helene. So
before the storm, there was a lot of organizing happening in Barnardsville that wouldn't classify itself as, quote unquote, mutual aid. And as Badger was talking about, the Big Ivy Community Center was and still is like a major hub of community resources with, a food pantry and an actual thrift store where things were 50 cents and not like Goodwill where they're like $10. And there was, a clinic that would come by, one of those portable clinics. And then just a lot of folks in this area, a lot of the old timers and even a lot of the more like recent folks that have moved to this area, like had a pretty like tight networks of just kind of like taking care of each other. There's like a email listserv where people put out asks and offers and things of that nature. And then there's just a lot of old connections in this area that focus around resiliency and community support. But some of it, maybe people would say like, we're doing mutual aid, but for the most part, it was just kind of like folks taking care of each other.
Yeah, kind of country people style, more like Nobody had a name for it. It's just, you need a ride to town, you pop down the listserv, you're probably going to find a ride to town. Yeah. Or if you have bigger needs and you talk to the folks at Big Ivy Community Center, they're going to work with you and try to figure out how to get you taken care of. And there are just long standing friendships and just community, I guess is the best way to put it. It's not like a bedroom community suburb where everybody goes to town to socialize or whatever. A lot of people in Barnardsville really spend an extraordinary amount of their time in Barnardsville and like hanging out in Barnardsville, going to parties in Barnardsville. A lot of people work in Barnardsville, and which is unusual these days for such a tiny town, especially near a big urban center. But all of those years of just hangouts or parties or whatever people have done really strengthened us for this particular storm.
So with communications down, with electricity down, can you talk about how you saw or what you've heard of people sort of finding themselves after, like, either like as the thing is happening, as the storm is happening, checking in on each other, or figuring out what the next steps are after the rain stopped and the waters dispersed?
Yeah, I can hop in on that with, like, I guess maybe my little story of directly after the storm and with like communication on that front. So pretty much, yeah, after the rain stopped, we thought it was pretty bad on the property where we live. And we weren't near the river, but a lot of trees had come down. And remember, we had to cut ourselves, use our saws to cut ourselves out of our driveway. A lot of trees had come down. And we drove down our road to kind of the main Barnardsville highway to check in on folks, and immediately ran into a couple friends who were kind of like, yeah, you ain't seen nothing yet, pretty much. And they said there was going to be a mutual aid meeting the next day at noon across from the post office. And since all communication was down, at least all of our communication, pretty much we drove around and we saw the devastation, and everyone was out, or a lot of people were just kind of out and walking along the road and just like looking. And we drove and we just spread the word about the meeting, like word of mouth out of our truck, and that, the next day at noon we were going to be across from the post office having a meeting. And yeah, that was my experience with that. And that was, I guess, Friday, right after the rains had passed and the sun had come out. And so that's how the first meeting got started. It was completely word of mouth, people just walking around or driving around, and everyone went and met up there the next day, where there was probably about 50 people or so that first day, Saturday.
Yeah, and I'd say basically same. I was out driving around, checking on friends, and also just checking on strangers. It's a small town. And so I actually heard about the meeting from someone I'd never met before, who was also driving around in their truck, checking on their friends. And we just rolled down our windows and started chatting. And then we started just having daily town meetings at noon every single day. And at that point in time, that was the only news source, the only communication source that really existed. Even the fire department for the first bunch of days couldn't radio out well. They said they would occasionally get a little patchy communication, but radio comms were pretty much down for them too. And so everybody came to these community meetings for the first week or two. It's hard. Time is really fuzzy there. So it's hard to know. Once Big Ivy Community Center opened back up, then things started to get a little more dispersed. But that was it. And we shared news of the world. We were all in our cars listening to the radio and the Buncombe County updates. And then we would share whatever anybody knew about where people could get gas and just anything, and people would, or missing persons, medical needs. So we had a medic area start up, and we were doing home visits on elders who were cut off and shut in, and there was no easy way to get to them. And so we had teams going out to check on folks, and we had pretty complex systems to get people's prescriptions refilled. We had folks like runners going to Charlotte every day or every couple of days to do that. So it was really, really complex, and at the same time, really, really simple, because it just boiled down to daily meetings and checking on folks in town and hearing who else needed checking on and going and checking on them. And that. Yep.
Yeah. After that first meeting on Saturday, we decided that the next day we were going to just go to the post office again at noon, have these meetings every day at noon, and we were going to cook a meal and start just setting something up. And then it just kind of accelerated at this really rapid pace. And we form into these different committees where there was the kind of like medical committee, water, food, like search and rescue and wellness checks. And people would just kind of break off to those groups after the meeting if they had a need in that area or if they had an offering. And so it was kind of this, spontaneous growth and organizing that people were able to jump into with that. And yeah.
One of the most amazing things to me about that time was our repairs crew.
Yeah.
People were coming in and just saying, I've got 3 trees down in my house and I've got 2 kids, and 10 people would just go tearing off to that person's house, get trees off, get them bucked up, and get a tarp over the roof so that they could function at least a little bit. And we have a lot of arborists in Barnardsville, which is wild. Like, I kept joking that was kind of like an actual percentage of our population, but it really might be. We have an extraordinary number of arborists, which we really needed after the storm, because trees on roofs are dangerous to try to cut down. And that was another one of our strengths. And it was just so amazing to see all that. So we were able to get a lot of people stabilized in their homes. I mean, still obviously none of the things they would usually have, and still with a hole in their roof, but at least dry and tarped and safe.
A couple of things occur to me. It's okay if neither of you feel like you it's your story to tell, but I've heard stories of people with access to tools actually repairing infrastructure like road stuff in the Barnardsville area. Is that a thing that you're aware of and you could speak to, or should I just move on?
Yeah, I love that story, actually. And I feel like it's fine to share about it. It was in a major national magazine. So somebody who has like a road building business is based in Barnardsville, and a lot of his employees are based in Barnardsville. So after the storm, they couldn't get in contact with each other by phone or anything, and the owner was cut off and stranded like a lot of folks. And so all of his employees just hopped on their equipment and started repairing the roads. And we all thought that they, like, the state had sent them or whatever. Like, it was a while before we realized they were just out in their boss's equipment repairing the road, and our roads got repaired so fast because of them. And finally the owner caught up with them, figure out what was going on, got on board, and after they finished Barnardsville, they went to Swannanoa, which also, where they desperately need some road repairs. And then I heard they were up in Burnsville. So they did amazing work. They didn't, they weren't like fancy paved roads, but you could get a 4-wheel drive truck over them. Whereas before, people were just totally cut off, and there was no way to get any kind of vehicle other than ATVs or your own 2 feet in and out. So that was amazing.
Yeah, and even on like a smaller level too, like a friend of mine had just a small excavator, and as soon as he got our road fixed, also was going out and like clearing other people's driveways and doing some basic grading, and didn't have, all the equipment of those big road builders, but was just kind of on a driveway by driveway basis. And I know more people than just him were doing that as well. They just had their small piece of equipment and were going and fixing people's roads and driveways.
There's just another story that I really love that I want to share about that. On the Barnardsville side of Pensacola. So Pensacola is this little community that is in Burnsville, but is right between Barnardsville and Burnsville on like back country roads. And they were totally cut off, and the storm hit them incredibly hard. We had a lot of really tragic stories coming out of there. So we were hearing from the fire department that they were cut off, and this amazingly huge spontaneous crew of just local guys on their ATVs with chainsaws. And Barnardsville has like kind of a lot of newcomers who are kind of like more back to the lander types, and they were up there with their chainsaws on their dirt bikes, and they just all went up together and cleared the road. It took them 2 days, but they just went hard until they had all those trees cleared so that you could at least get ATVs up into Pensacola. And the same thing was happening on the Burnsville side. And so eventually, right about the same time, everybody got into them. But that was like just such a cool story of people who never met, just hopping in and cooperating to get to folks who needed help.
I guess I was going to observe that, like, in the few emergencies that I've been through in my life, like thinking of the last two, like after the storm in this region and then COVID, time passes differently. You get an interruption of your normal patterns, your day-to-day operations, your work-a-day life. Like the economy stops in a lot of ways, or shifts, or breaks down, and people, hopefully they get what they need, but they get it in different ways and different ways of exchange. And it's interesting to hear stories of like people coming together and like having the time and the energy and the impulse to like have a meeting at noon. Like if you try to organize a meeting right now and it's not a paid at work thing and get people to go attend a thing, kids are at school, like adults are working or unable to get out of their houses. But with this sort of interruption, it's weird how it creates this opportunity maybe for people to come and pull together in ways that day to day they wouldn't be experiencing because they're so trapped in those patterns. Not to say that I want more emergencies, but just saying it's like, it's curious, and people talk about it after it's gone sometimes as like this weird dreamlike period. I don't know if you have any observations on that, or also simultaneous to that, another thing that's kind of weird and dreamlike is when authority in some ways kind of melts back because it doesn't have the infrastructure. Like city government doesn't operate the same way it did. Police don't operate in the same way that they have. People take it upon themselves to go and do these functions out of those meetings that normally would come down to some sort of like paid government authority. I don't know if that feels like it's a function of small community life where government is a little less in everyone's day to day, or if that's the nature of emergency and people banding together, or what.
I guess we're both thinking here. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you.
Well, yeah, the dreamlike nature. What's funny is a few months or a year or a few months before the storm hit, I was reading the book that's real hot right now in this area, but A Paradise Built in Hell, and about, for those not familiar with it, it kind of goes through these different disasters throughout history and how humans' natural response to that is mutual aid and cooperation, and it's almost like this, like a paradise, I guess, for lack of a better word. But I remember reading that and being like, yeah, this is like pretty much my philosophy as like an anarchist, is that when left to our own devices and when the constraints of capital and the state are washed away, is people are good and they help each other out, and things can be really beautiful. And when the disaster reached us, it was something that felt really affirming of like just seeing that happen in real life, of people coming together when they didn't have like this job that they had to like go to every day, and where there was almost more freedom in certain ways and for certain people, and that like what people did with that freedom and in the face of that of this disaster was band together and help each other out and build something that was beautiful together. Yeah, and it just showed how much more resilient and responsive and adaptive just community networks are compared to the state, especially in those first couple of weeks.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. Yeah, definitely the time thing was bizarre. Like nobody could remember whether something was yesterday or an hour ago or a week ago. We were all like so trying to track time together and failing. But I think a cool thing about Appalachia, but I do think it ultimately applies everywhere, is we always have a little less infrastructure. We're always a little more on our own. And I think that helped in a situation like this. And I think a cool thing about Barnardsville, I really noticed, and a lot of us were talking about that for the first 2 weeks, we're all in full shock. And that puts everybody in a certain kind of mode where we're just addressing the disaster. Like nobody has time to even think about feelings or, even our personal needs a lot of the time, like actual needs like food or whatever. And we're just really focused on emergently helping everybody that needs help. And then a cool thing that happened in our town is that a lot of people with a long history of strong organizing came together, and we just started to create systems really, really quickly. Because I think a thing I've seen when I've helped with other disasters and happen here too is like after 2 or 3 weeks, as the shock wears off and the feelings come up, things can start to get a little tricky or emotionally. And it's, I was jokingly calling it conflict o'clock during the disaster. It's like, oh, okay, it's that time where people are starting to have some stuff come up. And when we have a strong community, pre-existing strong community, and we have tight bonds and we've worked together to create really, really good systems, we had structures in place that we needed to support us when things started to get harder. Because in that dreamlike state, it's easier in a way because you're just like on another planet or something. And then, as we got more grounded, it got harder. And somehow while we were in shock, we had created all these amazing structures. And we were like, okay, all right, we have these meetings, we have structures for talking about things, we're getting through it, and we're still getting through it. Like we're still in it, it's not like this is over, at least not for our town. I think not for most small towns throughout the region. So yeah, and it's still going okay. And that doesn't always happen. So yay team, yay tight communities, and yay Appalachia.
Yeah, and I think there was also a simplicity that came with like the fallout from not having the internet or cell service, and with how hard our community here in Barnardsville was hit. Like it was hit hard all over in a lot of places, but we were here and we couldn't really communicate with many other folks. And we knew that we could go to the old fire station where eventually we kind of set up the hub at noon every day and plug into something that was pressing and urgent. And the rhythm and the actual like physical presence and physical communication of that system just was, I don't know, there was something grounding about that as far as like organizing goes, which like so much of it is just like over the phone and like trying to meet up at some place that's far away. But we were just here and we could go to the place and then do a thing. And it was really like, yeah, there was a simplicity and a beauty to that.
Yeah, I remember Jazz and I talking about that because we have a lot of friends in Marshall and in Asheville, and we were like, but here we are. we're in Barnardsville. I've been in the area for a long time. I have a lot of friends in Barnardsville too, but it was a thing to realize, like, okay, we're going to be organizing with folks who aren't necessarily who we're always doing this with, but like we're in this place at this moment in time. And like, not only does this just happen to be the place we are, and we're actually literally kind of stuck, but also it just felt really right to be in the place that we were in the world and connect with the people who were right here with us and not be just commuting, for whatever, to have community life or whatever. So it's so interesting to be forced to be place-based and to embrace that and have that go so beautifully. And it really did. And yeah, I'm so grateful for the community here. It's been extraordinary.
I remember hearing reports after the fact of tornadoes in Burnsville, and we sometimes get tornadoes in the mountains. They dissipate pretty quickly sometimes just because of the geography. But was that another thing that you all faced there, or was that pretty geographically specific?
We did. We had tornadoes. Martins Creek had really bad tornadoes, and my friends had a ton of trees fall on their house, which noontime meeting, people went and got all those trees off their house, but they had 8 trees fall on their teeny tiny little house, which is still standing. But yeah, if you drive up Martins Creek, it's like a tornado came through, like kind of like it was clear cut in an hour. It's wild.
Yeah, it's hard to say like what is what, and it's like, and it was just catastrophic wind events, and definitely things that seem, when you look at them, were like, yeah, looks like a tornado came through. And yeah, on the land that I live on, it's like there weren't these like wide swaths of trees that got taken down, but it was, dozens of trees that were just falling throughout the forest. So yeah, definitely like a lot of tornadoes and catastrophic wind events.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Welcome to Propaganda by the Seed, a podcast about plants and the nerds that love them. We alternate between hour-long interview episodes that usually focus on a single species or crop, and shorter episodes that focus on topics related to plants like grafting, composting, and the rest. You can find Propaganda by the Seed on the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts at propagandabytheseed.com or most podcast platforms. I'll see you deep in the weeds.
If you want to support the Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support. I am aware that the story is going to be different, but it's going to be kind of similar in a lot of different communities around Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee, of people banding together, people finding themselves with certain skill sets and certain tools in front of them and making do after they get isolated from everyone else with this big shock of the aftermath of the storm. And then people, as roads got repaired, as little bits of electricity or communication infrastructure started getting restored, people are traveling a little bit further and making connections. And what I've seen was this amazing blossoming of communication between similar communities, maybe having their own flavor of recovery immediately after the storm, but also their own specific needs to their communities, and a sort of communication give and take through these networks of various mutual aid groups or events or whatever in different communities. So like Mutual Aid Disaster Relief has had a hub in Asheville, and there's folks on the Pigeon River that it's set up, to do mutual aid there. And then there's been food and shelter being provided to some degree. Roar has a store that they've been, they just moved to a new spot like a month and a half ago. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience was of networking once you were able to make the connections outside of your community to other folks with a similar mindset, and like any observations that you have about helping coordinate some of the arborists in your areas to go, as you said, to Swannanoa or somewhere else like that. Like, how did that intercommunal communication happen? What did that look like?
Well, the first, I think, funny thing that kind of struck me was it's just a few days after the storm hit, someone realized or someone had found out that there was Wi-Fi available at the West Asheville Library. And there was this funny little exchange that I started making where we were bringing in truckloads of spring water into Asheville to like access the internet. Or it was just being like, oh, we're trading internet for water, which felt kind of funny and apocalyptic in a weird, dismal future way. But that's not really an inter-hub connection. But as the roads were opening up and the networks were opening up, there was a lot of it was still like physical, like because maybe we couldn't call right away. So we were driving out to maybe the Roar Hub or into Asheville with just some supplies and just being like, do you need any of this? And just kind of talking and trying to figure out what was missing where and trying to see who had it. And so a lot of it was in person at first, and then kind of a complicated spreadsheet system emerged of like text threads and such once we were able to get access to phones and all of that. But there was a lot of cooperation, definitely, between the hubs and cooperations between lots of like disparate organizing, like kinds of organizing, right? It wasn't just contained to our like niche mutual aid scene, but coordinating with lots of different hubs and church groups and community centers. And everyone was just trying to work together to get resources where it needed to go.
I think another interesting thing about all that goes back to the pre-existing community networks, because a lot of that early support could really only happen with people who we already knew who they were and where to find them and how to connect with them. And so, because there was no, like people are often in touch on texting apps, or if people are on social media, they're connecting through that. And a lot of those looser connections, just there was just no way to be in touch with any of those people who you only knew in that way. It was like, it's knowing people IRL and knowing people once we had a little bit of minimal cell service with emergency cell towers, then we could SMS text people. But of course, you had to already have their phone number. And so again, it's just, I feel like the number one thing people can do to prep for storms is build real and deep community networks, because that's how our hubs started, because people already knew each other and were able to connect and start making things happen.
Yeah. And how those relationships were able to like weave the networks together. Like I remember going to the medic station outside of the Double Crown in Asheville and just really knowing the people that were holding it down there. And so as I go into town, I'd be like, all right, like good, like you're here, what's up? And being able to connect, and like same thing with the Roar Hub. And so it was not only linked our own hub together because we had those relationships, but we were able to network kind of across the region. Mm-hmm. And locally too, I think there were a lot of relationships, or I know like a lot of relationships were made that people just like within proximity, because we couldn't really use the internet or the phones. And so kind of making these like really quick and like really deep, like organizing relationships with just people around Barnardsville. Yeah, that was really beautiful and exciting.
And another cool thing is that there were other hubs that were outside of our area that were providing deep support to us. And there was a hub, it may have been in Greensboro, but like kind of the North Carolina Triangle area, which is Raleigh, Durham, and then Greensboro, which is really close to them. They were all working really, really hard to just drive like one little carload at a time food and water and medical supplies to us, and to get out the word to other people to do that. So people, who we'll never even meet, coming from we'll never know from where, we're bringing in box trucks of supplies, bringing them to Greensboro where people could get to. And then they were finding the back roads to try to get to us and bringing us supplies, which I know for Barnardsville, all those like little carloads of supplies in the early days were feeding our town. And, but that was the same thing. That was like, we already knew a lot of those folks, and we had connections around the Southeast. And those connections really saved us. And we weren't the only ones. A lot of people have connections around the Southeast. So we're sending out word to all of our folks, and our neighbors are sending out word to all of their folks. And with everybody doing that, we ended up with, eventually we ended up with tons of supplies in Barnardsville. But in those early days, as soon as people were able to get to us, we started to have enough. And in those first few days, it was a little scary. We were down to like a few cans of food and a lot of hungry families. So, it's same thing. That's my new soapbox. Community has always been my soapbox, but now I'm like, whew, you can spend your whole life prepping, and it's just going to potentially go down the river in an hour. So prep those friendships instead.
Yeah. And then there was another kind of community connection that was, I think kind of unique to disaster situations, is there was folks rolling through our hub who were coming up from Florida, who'd been through a lot of hurricanes, or coming down from West Virginia and had been through the floods up there. And they were just like, yeah, we know what it's like, and rolling in with a truck that had a griddle and everything to cook up like breakfast biscuits and stuff. And they were just like, yeah, we've been through hurricanes. Like North Carolina folks have come down to us, and like, we're coming up to you now. And so this kind of, this network of people that have been through these kind of disasters before and just kind of know what's up and want to help out. And that was something that was really cool. And again, folks that I never met, might not never see again. And just kind of connected through the storm waters and the floods.
I passed through, after the storm, I passed through Roanoke, and they were doing fundraisers, and they had a warehouse space up goods for driving down also. So, I mean, it's really interesting and really cool, the sort of networks that get created for mutual aid and the folks that get drawn in. And while there was a lot of national media attention for a spell, and political figures from both major parties visited the region to profit off the devastation or to sling mud on each other, the media spotlight moved on to other news like the elections and the inevitable next natural disasters, wherever those may be, California or elsewhere. Can you talk a bit about the federal and state aid that you saw come in, where it went, where it didn't, and what remains need at that level?
I feel like I'm in some ways less tuned into that, because we've focused so much on other ways of getting aid to people in our town. But definitely FEMA was here, and I have heard some folks got support from them financially. But really, like, the bulk of support here has not come from the state. I mean, eventually state came in and rebuilt the roads properly, with whatever pavement and restructuring needed to happen. And certainly the fire department and Big Ivy Community Center are always supported by a lot of state funds, but that's a little different than your question. But like Big Ivy Community Center got a massive grant that they were able to distribute to people who needed to rebuild their homes, and that came from a private donor. We just so much of what has rebuilt, what we've been able to rebuild so far, I feel like has mostly been sourced through community and by community.
Yeah. So our first meeting on Saturday was kind of the first and last day I saw people from like the state in Barnardsville for a good while. And there's a swiftwater rescue team there that was going out from the Fish and Wildlife Department. And I just saw him that one day. I didn't really see him again. And I mean, Badger, I guess correct me if I'm misremembering, time is weird, but I feel like it was a week or 2 weeks before really seeing anyone from Red Cross or FEMA or the state, except for there were cops around intermittently. Besides for that, yeah, there wasn't much as far as the state being there, whether federal or local, providing support at all. And then I remember at a certain point, maybe it was 2 weeks in, the tone shifted in a big way, where it's like when the National Guard came and there was just kind of an influx of state power that was helpful in some ways and also just gummed up the works in a lot of other ways. Yeah, it kind of became a more like militarized zone there for a minute. Yeah, but I'd agree that really, especially in those first 2 weeks and after that, it was either our mutual aid networks or the Big Ivy Community Center or local churches that were doing the heavy lifting as like far as supporting folks. And I'd also agree that, where it seemed like the state was able to expend a lot of money and energy and time was like larger infrastructure repairs as far as the power and repairing the water lines in the city and doing the road work, even though a lot of that road work had been done already. But some of the bigger like sinkholes and stuff that destroyed pieces of major roads, they were coming in and fixing that.
Yeah. I forgot about power. That was nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard to track tracing it of being like who, because there was these linemen coming from all over the country and crews coming from all over. And was it the state, like was it North Carolina that was coordinating that, or FEMA? I mean, that's kind of like an area of things that I'm not so sure about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I feel like this is a good moment though to give a shout out to our fire department. Who did, like, any dangerous search and rescue that was happening during the storm. That was all them. And they, as it turns out, had not had swift water rescue training. So they were just winging it and did an amazing job. And that was hard for them. And they continue to, because as a nurse, I was out in the field a lot checking on elders who were cut off. And anytime we found anybody who needed extracting, because extraction was difficult because we didn't have roads, just cruise on by, let the fire department know. We're all just out on side-by-sides and ATVs and dirt bikes and whatever. So we would just pop in and they take their ATVs out and go get them wherever they need to go. And they were just amazing team players. So it's like, I don't want to discount any of the very real and strong efforts that were from more state supported agencies like the fire department. But in terms of bigger level stuff, yeah, like I feel like our town threw down hard for 2 weeks and really got a lot of things stabilized. And it did take a long time before outside help started to roll in.
Yeah. And the fire department did set up a distribution hub as well.
That's right. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, totally. So they're thrown down, and just as part of this tight-knit community fabric in Barnardsville.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me as trained individuals who are doing the job because they know they're going to be putting themselves into dangerous situations to help people. That makes a lot of sense. As opposed to the other agencies that are more like a long-term response. Like, all right, this thing has already happened. Like, how do we rebuild or what have you after this? The reason that I ask about that is because I'm sure that some people sent in crews and were doing work of their own accord, just as donated labor, but with some of the infrastructure, like rebuilding roads or what have you, in a lot of cases, small companies, independent contractors, whatever, would put in a request for repayment, for means, for materials, whatever, for time with the government. Like, say, roads get washed out, they rebuild roads that aren't just private roads, they would be applying for money after the fact. And I had, heard just anecdotal reports that a lot of money was not even just anecdotal. There was some local news saying months after the fact that monies hadn't been distributed to those small companies that were coming out to do some of that infrastructure repair, which means that local people or people, whatever, weren't getting paid for the work that they had done around that, which, folks in the community are doing it because it's their community. But, once capitalism starts rolling again, people need money to pay for goods and services. And also because in the last month or last 2 weeks, I guess, FEMA had stopped paying a lot of people's housing vouchers, people who had been made homeless. If their houses had been recognized as, had been affirmed to be unlivable or uninhabitable, they might have gotten vouchers. And in some cases, FEMA was withdrawing those vouchers. So people were being kicked out of hotels, at least in Asheville. So those two things. And then the reports about what kind of state funding goes to coastal communities after there's a hurricane, where people have the big fancy beach houses versus the amount of money that was distributed to mountain communities for recovery after the storm. Those were sort of the things that were in my head. But if you can't speak to those things, and I could just leave it there and put some links in the show notes for folks to read more.
Yeah, I think I don't have good insight on that, just because I feel like we just went about things in a bit of a different way. Maybe because people don't have multi-million-dollar houses out here. There are a couple, but mostly not. So it's maybe they just didn't come out here, and we're not tuned in. Therefore, FEMA did come out, but it's I don't know.
I can speak to some of those things on an anecdotal level from maybe not as much as state contracts or federal contracts for small businesses, but I work on a small tree crew and doing a lot of taking trees off people's houses and things of that nature. And, in the very early days, it was all, people were like, money, what's money? Doesn't matter. And then, as you said, as the constraints of capital came in, that changes a little bit for everyone. And there's a lot of things where, we're billing people, but it's just when insurance or when FEMA is able to do it. And that process is slow or not really happening, where people have work that needs to get done or work that got done, but the insurance or FEMA, which is kind of one arm of it is an ineffectual insurance agency. It's not really following through to support people in that way. And so that's definitely a challenge. And then there's just a lot of situations where people lost their housing, but they didn't own the home, they were renting. And there's all these caveats and ways where people just, they don't meet the requirements for whatever aid is being offered out there. And anecdotally, a lot of people who maybe did own their homes, but they didn't have flood insurance because they weren't technically in a floodplain. What FEMA is offering them is really inadequate. And I definitely have heard that a lot from quite a few folks in this area.
So now that we're, 4 months out from the storm, you've mentioned devastation. The shape of the town has changed because of the way that the waterways were running through it, ran through it. And the temperatures have changed. If around the time of the storm, it wasn't, it was actually unseasonably warm. And even though we've had some wildfires a little bit south of you, the temperatures have been, in single digits, teens and 20s a lot. How are folks, what are some of the issues that people are continuing to deal with as effects of the storm? And how is the local support effort going?
I can speak to that. We have a lot of people in Barnardsville still living in tents and living in campers that aren't connected to any infrastructure. And so our long-term recovery is challenging in terms of taking care of all of the folks who have been displaced, and it has been particularly challenging through the winter. Big Ivy Community Center has a lot of folks camping there, and they've gotten them little portable propane heaters. And then Barnardsville Area Resilience Network that Jazz and I are plugged into we worked closely with the community center to create an additional network of folks that are going around checking on folks. I connected with the county in January to try to get all the displaced folks in Barnardsville counted in the point in time homeless count last month, which was actually last week. And of course, we didn't get to everybody, but they did. Barnardsville has just sort of off the map in a lot of ways from the perspective of the county at least when it comes to thinking about unhoused folks and displaced folks. And the more they realize that we have a lot of displaced folks in our community, the more resources they can get to our community partners that are helping make sure that everybody is fed and warm and at least people have their most basic needs met. So, but it's long, and I don't know really what we're going to do. I know we keep trying to get people tiny homes. We were getting people hot tents, which was great, but then the hot tents are like canvas tents that can have a wood stove. But then there was an issue with the hot tents going up in flames because people were really cranking their wood stoves in the cold. So that's not so good. The little sheds and tiny homes that are getting distributed seems to be our best short-term solution. And maybe that's our long-term solution, but it's a big thing in our community right now, trying to hold everybody close who has lost so much and get people back into at least some sort of housing. And we're not there yet at all. I would say most people have campers, but definitely not everybody. And the campers are not really a reasonable long-term solution because we don't have a way to connect those campers to any kind of infrastructure. So people are just in them without plumbing or a really appropriate heat source or electricity other than hopefully a generator, but not always. Yeah, we did have a lot of not a lot, but a few different crews bringing solar panels out to our area, and that's been really helpful. But again, that's not like the solution to the problem, but it has been helpful. Yeah, I wish I had more of an idea of what our solution is, but I think it's just going to be long and slow and frankly pretty grueling.
Yeah. Going off that, there is a big transition right now in our reality and our thinking that the big cold really emphasized, which is like we have lots of stuff here in Barnardsville. It's like as far as like socks and clothing and just kind of like material things that got donated for canned food. And in the early days, that was like essential to get that out to people. But we're really moving into, and we are in like an infrastructural crisis with all the people that have lost their housing and where are they going to be, and just figuring out these bigger infrastructural issues that we're facing. And kind of with that, or almost like the next stage of that as I see it, is these like systems issues, because a lot of the problems that our community is facing existed long before the storm, as far as not having access to adequate housing or to food or to heat, and realizing that this like rush to return to normal and get things back to normal is like the normal is like substandard and is like not working and does not support so many people in our community. And in a way, it's like with like the efforts of the state are just to like maintain that normalcy, but to really address the issues that the storm caused and amplified is like, changing our systems. And I think of that with, we expanded like a firewood program that at Roar we were doing here in Barnardsville of like distributing free firewood to folks. And that's been like the amount of wood that we've delivered or that people have picked up from the community center because we've been stocking wood there, just like far outpaces any year that we've done it in the past. But people have always needed it in the past, and they're going to keep needing it in the future. And so it's just, I think just the realization of like the scale of the disaster, but also just like the scale of like what our community has needed and always needs. And that the storm really brought that home, I think. And so as we're in this phase that's like not the immediate like crisis o'clock, and kind of like looking into like the deep dark big future, how do we like support like infrastructure for folks like in the immediate, but also like look at systems and ways that we like actually relate and support each other in a way that's different than just a return to normal.
Yeah, I guess with something you and I were messaging about before, Jazz, and to touch on something that Badger had said, Appalachia's in the common mythos, at least since the 60s, but before that too, of being this like marginal, but also kind of in the center of the country or at a time area that is forgotten, or like to borrow a term from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, like is experiencing organized abandonment, like a lot of rural areas around the country. And so that's sort of like sustaining it at a place where it's just enough to be able to extract from without keeping it in a position where it's actually in danger of making a change on its own. I guess any question that I would have had about like normalcy isn't maybe what I should be asking about, but I wonder, and considering like living around here, hearing people talk about, there was this big storm in the early 90s, there was this hurricane that came through in blah, blah, blah year, the early 2000s, like people still are living with the devastation and destruction of those past things and have learned to live with them and adapted their living around that. So I wonder, like moving forward, as we see more climate chaos, as we see more events like this happening, again, to point back, y'all had mentioned pre-existing community ties and organizing experiences being two things that really helped to set the stage for some successes in responding to this crisis. Are there any other observations, any things that you hope to work and have like as a part of the social fabric for the next time that this happens, or any sort of like lessons you want to share with other folks in the listening audience who are going to be affected by similar things?
I think we've all been talking about that a lot out here. And I think kind of like you're saying, or I don't know, maybe it's not quite what you're saying, but I think organized abandonment is a great way to describe the experience of a lot of folks in Appalachia. And I think when generations have lived through that, then developing ways to sustain ourselves in like whatever may come down the pike is just a normal part of the culture. And then as we all talk about going forward, I think what we're talking about is doing more of what we'd already been doing and more of what we're doing right now, which is kind of cool. It's not like we're not starting from ground zero. We're not like, wow, we sure should get out and meet those neighbors. We knew the neighbors, and we need to keep reaching out to folks we don't know. We need to have more ways to connect. And I feel like those are happening. And I think everybody is both a little more and a little less of a prepper than we used to be, because we've all seen what can happen to everything you own. And I think we've all seen things that we could have done differently, whether in terms of developing skill sets, strengthening networks, and, being strategic about what kinds of supplies we do keep on hand and where we keep them and how we coordinate things like that as a community. I think those are the kinds of things that we're all talking about and doing. There are a lot of supplies in Barnardsville these days, and we have some cool strategies in place for how to store them, what to store, what to give away, what we felt was critical to have on hand in the early days after the disaster. And the reality is the next disaster could be something totally different, and none of our really material plans could, those might end up being totally useless, but our community plans, I think, are always useful. How we connect, how we rescue each other, how we extract each other, and how we take care of each other, both now and certainly when there's a disaster happening. So I'm sorry, that was sort of a long-winded answer, but it's on my mind all the time. So
it was a long-winded question. I think it was a good answer.
Yeah, if I could just jump off that for a second too, because I totally agree with Badger that the most resilient resource that we have is each other and our community and building those connections. And so no matter what the next disaster is, it's we're building those. And what is really hit home for me with this is how important it is to organize and build connections outside of our social milieus and our little circles that we have. And it's those are so important, and we should tend those. And also, I might not go to church, but I want to organize with this church, get supplies out to people. Or our organization structure at Barnes, really different than the community center, but we're all part of this community working together. And so, yeah, just to get to know all of our neighbors and to, realize that we all do need each other, not only when these disasters strike, but all the time. And I think that's the tragedy of normalcy or of just return to capital, is that isolation from each other and the polarization that kind of comes out of that, because that's when the storm washed all of that away, along with everything else. Yeah, it left us with each other and an opportunity to connect and to grow together.
Well, how can folks learn more about Barn or get involved if they're in the area, or support it if they have a little extra money they can send? Is that do you take donations? Do you have any sort of online presence, or is it just on the ground? And if not online, are there any other groups you want to shout out that people could check out?
we have a website. Do you know what our website is, Jess?
Oh, I thought you were going to know. I think it's Mutual Aid Barnardsville.
I think that's what it is. That's what came to my head too. Mutual Aid Barnardsville. And yeah. I think on that website there are listed some avenues for donations. I wouldn't say we're super actively accepting any kind of donations right now. But if somebody was bound and determined to donate to us, they should be in touch, because we are continuing to try to serve our community as best we can. And if somebody was like, I live in Barnardsville, I was here this whole time, I wanted to connect and I didn't know. Yeah, they could just reach out on the website. There's an email listed on the website, and that email is monitored. And yeah, go ahead, be in touch. We don't have our hub anymore, sadly, but we're still here, and we're all pretty connected to Big Ivy Community Center, which is just sort of like the bigger hub for the whole community. And be in touch. Let us know if you're here.
Awesome. Well, Badger and Jazz, thanks so much for the conversation and for sharing your stories. And I'm glad to be in community with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for for having us on. It was a cathartic session to talk about all this.
It's so good to be able to talk about it and tell our stories. I don't think we get to do that all that often because we've all been through it, and we all know the story. So, yeah.
I think, and this is just kind of a side note or whatever, but it seemed like someone from Blue Ridge Public Radio was compiling people's stories. If I can find that, if that's up on the internet, then I'll link that in here too, because that seems like oral histories, I think, are really powerful. As you said, for the teller as well as for the listener.
Mm-hmm. And the Blue Ridge Public Radio person spent a lot of time in Barnardsville, like at least, a lot being maybe 2 or 3 days, I think. But, and so they actually collected a lot of stories from our town too. So that would be a really cool link to pop on for folks.
Yeah. The local NPR really showed up. I know that like Asheville FM was off air, didn't have internet at the studios, and didn't have electricity for a long time at their West Asheville studios. But BPR was broadcasting all the like safety information and official meetings and whatever. Like big ups to them for that.
Mm-hmm.
I know. I still remember just sitting in the truck, like taking notes from the broadcast so that we could share it at our community meetings.
Yeah, that sort of information about like where do you go to get potable water, like what times is this like food pantry open or whatever. If you don't have internet, like radio is an amazing tool for getting that into people's cars.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I'll let you all go, and we'll keep in touch.
Cool.
All right, sounds good.
All right,
thanks, Bert.
This is The Final Straw Radio. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.